Okay, great. Hopefully we can record the meeting today.
Looks like we've already got notes filled in.
Yep. Yeah, Red Hat now. Okay, we have Spike here. And Deepa, could you write down your name on the meeting note?
Deepa, can you hear us?
No, there's a chat.
Sorry, I was on mute. But yeah, I just put my name down.
Okay. Oh, could you introduce yourself a little bit? I don't believe we meet you last time.
Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, Ramiro told me about this group, and that's how I came about joining it. But briefly, I work for VMware, and we're starting to look into service mesh in general.
Okay.
And we're very interested on the policy angles of Kubernetes and Istio. So that's why I'm here.
Okay, cool. Okay, I think we can start today's meeting. So the first item on the agenda is to approve. So I moved some of the really great meeting notes from our last meeting to the design doc so that we could, crystallize all the great discussions. So there are 3 occasions of modification. The first one is that we discussed about HBO use cases, InfoSec use cases extensively. I think last week. So I would suggest we just add one subsection that for all the use case discussion that based on category or persona that we could add more categories later from different either industry or other aspect of things. Does it sound okay for you guys?
Yeah, I actually had that question because I wasn't sure if it was okay to add a few more use cases or we should just stick with those 2 and work out of those 2 for the moment. I don't know what you guys were thinking about that.
Do you have like a different use case that's a completely different category than these ones that you're thinking?
Well, I think you could sort of, I was thinking about the use case, worked a lot with this insurance company out of Canada, and they had these very hard requirements about geofencing of the data, essentially. What applications can reach where, what users can touch. If you have an application, say in Germany, the data restrictions are extremely harsh, right, in that sense. And policy could be very powerful in that kind of context, I'm thinking. But I don't know if that's totally within the scope of what we're trying to achieve here or not. That's why I just didn't want to add it. I just wanted to ask first.
Yeah, so this is Michael. I joined a minute late, but I think the idea of the kind of geofencing, I think it kind of fits also into kind of compliance and InfoSec.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I would be comfortable if we wanted to add a third scenario or just try to augment more specifics around the InfoSec to highlight that strict role-based access control based on the origin of users who are interacting with the system.
Right. Perfect.
Yeah, and I would suggest we just like allow folks to add more use cases, and for each meeting we could discuss and see if it can be fitted into any existing categories or it should be belong its own new category.
We can be at hip and rename InfoSec GRC if we wanted.
Yeah,
to cover all those cases.
yeah, just write down suggestions, and every meeting we could come through and approve it, or edit it.
I like the idea of replacing the infosec, or at least extending it with this geofencing one, just because it's more concrete. The one I think we have right now is maybe not, at least what's in the notes doesn't seem as concrete as the HBO one. It's just like security, and then that's it. So the geofencing thing would ground it nicely, I think.
Okay, so replace infosec with
Replace or extend, whatever you guys
geofencing.
Yeah.
With I would say with governance, risk management, and compliance.
Exactly.
That's the terms, I guess, now in organizations.
Government risk,
Right.
compliance.
Governance, risk management, and compliance. Yeah.
Okay. I'll add it later. Compliance. C. Okay. Okay, great. The second addition, I think, is that last meeting we talked a lot about the scope. So I think we could just add a dedicated subsection regarding the discussion of scope here. And obviously we'll need like more input, but let's just put the note from last meeting here, and we could further polish it. And so does this sound okay for you guys? So we have a dedicated section to describe the scope, like the litmus test and all this discussion about the difference between the config and policy.
Could you repeat what your question was there, or was it a question?
Yeah, so my suggestion is to add a dedicated section about scope under section 3, so that we could put every discussion related to scope here. Is that okay?
Sounds good to me. Yeah. I was told to make sure that we don't re-implement LDAP.
Yeah. Okay, then.
I mean, I think that section is kind of getting into like definitions, or like not just like a glossary, but like actually defining what's different here than somewhere else. I don't know if this is like scope necessarily as it's currently.
Okay, so what would be a better
both
term?
Sound good.
Okay, scope for glossary or terms, definitions, right? Definitions.
Yeah.
And I think eventually we're going to want both.
Yeah.
Because in order to form a Kubernetes working group, like the charter is going to have to answer questions about what is the scope of work that we're doing, which is, related, but still a slightly independent concept than just defining the terms that we're going to use in the rest of the document. And both are useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds great.
So for me, I think for the scope question, this is something that's intended across many different SIGs, understanding where the boundaries are between what a SIG does. So if we pick on network policy, maybe to pick a strong area for Spike, network security policies, at what point does a network security policy from a network SIG begin to be influenced by or become part of this work group versus just becoming part of that? And to Erica's point about not reinventing LDAP, the existing role-based, the role bindings and cluster roles and things like that are already some form of that. So I think for me, it would help to clarify what's the outcome intended by the policy work group. Is it sort of influencing and looking for standardization across these different areas? How creating something new that doesn't exist? I think there were some discussions around multi-cluster scenarios and others, and the sort of compliance enforcement scenarios, which I don't see anything in the community today that I think would address that as is. So to me, that's more than just kind of defining what policy is versus config, but also where the mission of the work group has a definitive boundary with other SIGs.
Yeah.
And Spike, is that kind of what you're really trying to nail down as well?
Yeah, it's less about like
Jesus.
carving up territory of Kubernetes, but more about just like understanding how far-reaching the goals that we have are, and I'm always wary about working groups without a good idea of what their scope is and without a good idea of what their goal is, because they often kind of devolve into a bunch of divergent discussions, and it's hard to focus and it's hard to get work done. So it's less about like, I mean, we are going to have to deal with the problems of like, there are other working groups that are working on these different areas, right? The network working group, has a bunch of experts on network policy, and so there will be some overlap. And I think that it's not necessary to say that there can't be any overlap, but we do have to figure out, how we're going to work with them, and get agreement that they're going to either review our stuff or basically just figure out what the relationship is, rather than like some sort of mutual exclusion.
But can you make the case, for example, that network policy is essentially a subset of what we're trying to achieve here? It's one use case of what policy could look like.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, because network policy is both a sort of area that we know is part of the problems that we want to solve, but I don't think that we want to have this work group start defining the intricate details of all the different areas where policies could be. So yes, it's in our scope, but also there are things about network policy that we don't want to get into either. So, yeah,
so really, though, if I could distill and kind of paraphrase, I think what you're highlighting is that the scope of this work group is addressing policy where it crosses multiple SIGs with a specific goal of driving an end-to-end set of capabilities along either capacity management, compliance, security, et cetera, at least the two use cases that we have now, and then decide later on if we grow the use cases. I know there was that suggestion, but defining the scope as really the areas of policy that cross many different SIGs and trying to drive an end-to-end story for a particular business use case.
Yeah, so I think having a crisp, I think having a crisp description of the goals of the working group should be a high priority, because anybody looking at the doc is going to be wondering what the heck we're trying to accomplish, and so that should be upfront and very clear, and it should make it clear that we're not trying to reinvent network policy or RBAC or anything like that.
Yeah. So there's actually already the mention of that in the motivation section. So the question for me is that shall we clarify the mission and the relationship in the motivation section, the first section up front, rather than put it in the scope and definitions?
I mean, I think that scope is going to be a section that sort of needs to stand on its own, so that people can jump right into it and understand what this working group is doing and what this working group isn't doing. I mean, the motivation is going to be background and kind of explaining why we're doing anything at all.
Okay.
And so putting that sharp definition seems like it should be.
Yeah, am I right? There seems to be the goals we should define, are specific objectives of what would be successful within what time frame. Then there's also what is okay to use to solve whatever to get there. That's kind of, I think, the scope part as opposed to the goal part. I don't know if that clarified anything, but
Yep. I think, okay. So the last place of editing is we discuss about, for example, the difference between security or auth facing policy and like resource related policy on network storage. So shall we add like dedicated sections under the overall architecture that clarify these terms? So does it sound reasonable? Because after all, we are gonna give like overall like fundamental view of how the working group seeing policies in Kubernetes, right?
I imagine a FAQ section would very quickly devolve into how is this different from this and why are the terms different.
Any other suggestions?
So I think what's written there in terms of security policy versus resource policy is a way to divide up the space. Seems completely reasonable. I think that there's not going to be significant differences in auditability. I think all policy updates and all places where policy generates behavior of the system to either align or enforce policy should have a very clean audit trail. In particular, the suggested geofencing scenarios, every organization that's in a situation that needs that kind of geofencing of their data is going to have a very strict audit requirement of who has access to the data, and policies will affect who has access to the data, therefore all of the aspects there. So I don't really think there's difference in auditability between access control policies, or I think what you would label here security policies, and resource policies. Because I think even with resource policies, you want to know when did the policy increase the size of the cluster or decrease it based on some conditions or some other behavior, and who instituted the original policy, who was sort of the originator of that kind of dynamic behavior. I think you still want to trace back to know, did Howard make the change or did Erica make the change, and why? So I think auditability is going to be critical on both sides. I think differentiating enforcement style, I don't know if the heavy sigh was firm agreement or frustration, but I think for the enforcement style, calling out proactive versus reactive versus kind of ongoing monitoring and reporting is a really useful thing to differentiate, because I think that will kind of categorize how the policies are written. Some policies are going to be report only, tell me what happens in the system so I can just manage it, right? So I can kind of turn on the policy engine and I can see an ongoing stream of information about what it might be doing as a way for users to build trust. And then proactive, I immediately want to make this change across all clusters, versus whenever there is this set of conditions and apply the policy in this way in a reactive model. I think that third item to me is probably the most useful of the bullets that are written, because I think that does divide how policy might be written and how it's being enforced or implemented on a set of clusters or one cluster.
Yes, I was going to say that I think the difference is often sort of the aggregate on write versus read idea, but I think you covered that within different ways of figuring in what you keep and do with the information. So.
Okay, then we can agree that we put a dedicated FAQ section maybe in the appendix to illustrate the difference. Would that be okay? Then we could focus on the enforcement style. Could that be the conclusion?
Yeah, I'm good with an FAQ. I'll go back to, I think, differences in auditability. I have a hard time concluding that there would be any differences in auditability if I'm dealing with security-based policy or resource-based policy.
Yeah, we can edit the content later for sure, because we are gonna like come through the whole document step by step. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Sounds great.
Do we also want to cover? There's like how the policies get enforced, which is that last point. But then there's also like the entire like management plane for policies, and like how do you distribute policies? How do you obtain visibility into the decisions that are being made, why they're being made? How do you test them? How do you like on and on it goes. So is that part of this section?
I don't know whether it should be part of the difference. So do we have difference on the management plane regarding these two types of policies?
I think the question more is there a management plane?
I'm asking because we've got this architecture and we're talking about different enforcement styles. So it's obviously got to be part of the architecture. The other part of the architecture that I think we should address is the management of policy within Kubernetes.
But the question here is that does it belong to this specific section that we will be discussing about the difference?
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry, I misunderstood.
Okay.
But I do think, to Torin's point, that section on architecture should do more than elaborate the differences. I think it should also describe, at least conceptual architecture. What are the pieces that we're going to need to define? What are some pieces that we might reuse? Like Torin, I'm interested in your input on whether OPA as a policy engine becomes a component of how this is driven forward. Is that the right use case for it, et cetera? If it is, does it already, and I'm not deep enough on OPA yet, but is there a distributed management plane that could address this within a cluster? They could define all the auditability, as policies change or as changes are made on behalf of policies. So for those types of things, I think elaborating it would be helpful for everyone to come to a common view.
Yeah, that's for sure. We're going to add a lot of things under this section. So this is just a sketch. Yeah. Okay, if there's no further questions, we're moving on to the next item. So about the discussion on the MVP goals, right? So last time there are two major points made. That the first one is use case, we just discussed, and the second one is to have a scope. We also discussed. So on a broad level for our design document, anything else that we need to put extra focus on?
I think this topic that we're just on around at least the conceptual architecture of what pieces, being a little bit more detailed than kind of dividing auth versus control policy, something that specifies a bit more about the management plane versus the enforcement plane versus the reporting plane, ever how those are going to come together. I do think that will be helpful to at least build a straw man that we can either argue over the different pieces or come to a consensus that, yep, this more or less looks like what makes sense.
Yeah, so like a v.0.1 kind of like architecture.
Yeah. So anything else?
I'm a little unclear about what, like when we say this is a design document, it's a design for this working group, a design for how the technology is going to solve the use case. What is it that we are designing?
So my thinking was we're designing an overall architecture without, too much details, that we could both encompass all the existing solutions. So we don't want to reinvent any wheels, right? And also capture many of the future directions that we will hope Kubernetes to evolve on the policy aspect. So that would be my thinking on this. So the design document
is to design this architecture by KubeCon.
At least like Torin said, we output a 0.0.1 version of this is a like high level architecture that we believe that could both fit into the existing Kubernetes architecture, as well as provide a guide about how the future directions could look like.
So maybe, Spike, are you kind of on the point about the document right now is merging concepts of workgroup charter and goals of a high-level design
Yeah.
specification. These are the straw men.
Yeah, basically that's kind
Basically,
of reading it. I'm not really sure which one it is.
I think it would be great to have the combination of these two, so that we don't have like extra. We working on the charter, and then there'll be like too time consuming. It would be great that we could accomplish those two broad goals with this one design document.
One thing that has helped me understand Kubernetes better is often that we don't mean architecture in terms of actual running code components, but actually just a shared abstraction that we hope other people can build against and plug into.
Yeah, conceptual architecture. We will now like mandate any implementation details, at least at this stage. So, anything else like on the major aspect of the document that we want to carry in addition to the current content and this, additional content?
I think that seems reasonable. Kind of going back, originally we stated this goal of an MVP by KubeCon. Here we're kind of highlighting the things to close out in this document. Are we anticipating implementing a running MVP as a straw man by KubeCon?
I don't think we could have the bandwidth to achieve that. Well, maybe for KubeCon, like for the end of the year event. So for the second half of the year. But for the Copenhagen, for the May time slot. So I think it would be great if we could come up with a concrete design document that both serve as a charter as well as a very first draft of a conceptual overview architecture for the Kubernetes policy.
Okay. Would we also want to establish a repo where we could begin collecting some hypothetical examples and kind of working through whether they might make sense?
I'm not sure. Do you guys think this is necessary? If so, I can talk to submit something to create the repo.
It might be a little too early. I think ideally, yes.
Yeah.
Code is usually the easy part anyway. So.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Then let's just stick to the document, and maybe after KubeCon in May, we could make some progress on the repo. Okay.
That's fair. That's fair.
Okay. Moving on the procedure-wise, I submit a pull request to the community to add the working group to the list. I think it will be merged either by the end of the week or next week. So. Okay. Next one, the communication mechanism. So I was thinking about maybe we have volunteering champions for different areas or different SIGs. So would that be a good way for you guys, for the working group to interact with the different related SIGs? For example, between the SIG network and the policy work group, that we have one volunteer that will report any SIG networks progress on policy related aspects. And then if we have something want to discuss with the SIG network, that people will be like the representatives of the policy network. Any thoughts on that?
I like that idea, but I don't know necessarily how or what will interact with whatever happens for me going forward, but I hope other people could.
The thing is that with that, you're
calling for volunteers right now. Is that
hopefully not yet, but I'm thinking that with this, you're essentially signing up for 2 SIGs, right? You're signing up for the working group that we have now, which is already it's not that hard to do, but then you have to also sign up for another one, and now you have 2 things that you kind of balance.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my thinking was that it should be volunteers, right? So if you are already working on a specific area, for example, for me, I will volunteer for the storage, for the SIG storage. So since I have already been looking at the policy aspect of the SIG storage, so that would make sense that I volunteer to be the liaison or whatever for the policy working group.
So what you're envisioning is essentially during those other meetings, if you have those weekly or bi-weekly or whatever, you're going to essentially share with them what we're doing here and capture use cases or feedback that could be useful here. Is that exactly what you're saying?
Yeah. If necessary, yeah.
Right.
So in that way, we don't increase anyone's bandwidth. So we don't want to like mandate tasks to anyone. So as long as we have people that are already working on like networking or authentication, storage, then we could volunteer to be the liaison and provide some update from time to time. It's not mandatory, so that we could effectively collect information that we don't become outdated.
Well, maybe we could flip this around and say, is anybody actively engaged with any of these SIGs today? And if so, then they're just like the de facto volunteers for that, and they can report back because they're already doing that regularly. And then like maybe we can look at talking to people in those other SIGs to see if they would be interested in working inside this one. And if all of that fails, then we can try to like, if we're committed enough, then we can volunteer.
I mean, my hope would be
forced volunteering.
We don't actually need sort of a full person.
Yeah.
Kind of going to every meeting. All of these, there's like a dozen.
Yeah. I know.
And so, I mean, I think we can be a lot more targeted in our communication with these SIGs. They all have mailing lists, so we know that the work that we're doing intersects with some SIG. We can email them, or we can say, hey, can we have a slot on your meeting agenda, and we want to present something to your SIG group. So I don't think that like it's certainly nice when you have people that are regularly going to multiple SIGs, but I don't think that we need to make it an explicit goal that there's a member of this working group covering every other SIG that we think we might interact with.
Okay. So the conclusion would be let's make it more spontaneously, right?
Well, I guess as needed rather than.
Okay. Well, event trigger.
Rather than guessing which SIGs might have something when we think it might be, then we'll worry for that specific SIG. Is that all right?
Okay.
I'm pretty sure once you announce or this becomes public that we actually have this working group in the community, more people will eventually join. I think as more awareness grows.
Yeah, that cross-pollination will happen to a certain extent without us taking explicit actions.
I'd also suggest we as we define that scenario, we'll highlight what are the top 2 or 3, right? Our first goal to kind of drive an end-to-end scenario won't be over all of the SIGs, but 2 or 3 SIGs. And we'll kind of scope down how we want to collaborate with that set of SIGs.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Because even if we were to all start attending scheduling, or one of us, the fact that the scenarios we're dealing with now, do they address scheduling or not? If they don't, then there's not really a whole lot we can share that's interesting to the scheduling SIG, and there may not be a whole lot that we would learn or incorporate from the scheduling SIG. but things like network and auth, maybe storage, are things that would be interesting from a geofencing compliance standpoint.
Yeah, I think this is a really great suggestion. To conclude that we ID the 6 per scenario. So for example, when we discuss about the HBO use case for like 2 or 3 weeks. So if we ID, there's like 1 or 2 SIGs that closely related to the use case, then we could like work on that specific SIG for that like period. So is that correct?
Yeah, quick check that we're gonna get kicked out of this Zoom, by the way, in less than a minute.
Yeah. There's a part 2.
Yeah,
so
the secondary. Yeah, right.
Yeah, let me just stop and everyone join the part 2. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, guys. And meeting.